We are discussing violence, Paul's drunken outbursts where he destroyed furnishings and frightened his children, secret homosexual relationships that almost ended their hardcore, bedroom roleplay and marriage that strained every possible limit. However, that is only the start. This individual is an awful father to the extent that he essentially murdered his own son, and Noah's wife with Alzheimer's has finally revealed details that would help you see Paul Newman as the true monster. Imagine this. Ohio is in 1925, and a newborn is born into what appears to be a wonderful family in the middle. His father has his mother attends church. Everything appears to be typical. However, within that house, everything is going to be complete agony. Just one day. The father of Paul Newman was a violent alcoholic who tormented his family like a crazy person. Paul, the little one, would hide when his father got home, behind his bed. Being aware that furniture will soon fly and the beginning of screams was imminent, Arthur Newman wasn't merely severe, he was cruel in ways that caused Paul's brain to malfunction for him. He would force his glasses and totables, shout that Paul had no value, and inform his son that he would never be able to. Would you be able to hear that? Trash every day when you were a child. Paul's father essentially taught him to despise himself, and that loathing of oneself would destroy everything Paul has ever touched, even his own kids. Though the psychological harm was so great that even after Paul became the most popular film American celebrity, he continued to hear his father's voice calling him worthless. He would place themselves before mirrors and he detested what he saw, so he smashed them. At upscale Hollywood events, while Paul would drink while everyone applauded him and murmur that he wasn't worthy of. His psyche was poisoned by his father, therefore he believed that success was a falsehood that was broadcasting to the world. Following a high, Paul attempted to get out of his terrible upbringing by turning into amp. He married a lovely woman in 1949, known as Jackie Witt, who provided him with 3 lovely kids. For several years, Paul might be able to construct he never had a pleasant family when he was growing up. Jackie supported his aspirations and helped his acting career, which was floundering. Their children loved him. At last, life was. However, in 1953, Paul backstaged with Joanne Woodward at Theater, and they met for the first time, explosive in every manner imaginable. They couldn't tolerate one another. Joan believed Paul to be uninteresting and phony, while she was noisy and annoying too. Paul, they get into yelling altercations that ended everyone is uneasy around them. No one could have anticipated that these two individuals who were hostile to one another would quickly develop an obsession with one another in the most heinous manner imaginable. When they were compelled to collaborate on a film, 1957, something twisted took place. The animosity transferred into a fear-inducing lust. Both of them. Paul remained wed. Tojaki has 3 children living at home, but Heckle didn't help but be drawn to Joanne. They began a covert relationship that was carried out in budget hotels and secret places where Paul's wife and kids at home. I waited for him without knowing in the worst way. Daddy was betraying them. In the most practical manner. The relationship continued 4 years, shattering Paul from the inside out. He enjoyed the thrill of skulking around. He detested himself for his relationship with Joanne. Ruining his first family. Jackie discovered the truth at last and was heartbroken. The female supporter Paul had children as a result of his dreams. It has trashed so he could pursue his fixation on Joanne. Jackie was divorced in 1958 to wed his, but he was consumed by guilt forever. The wedding ought to have been. Paul was drowning in shame, but he was thrilled over his first family's treatment of him. He began drinking to dull the agony heavily, and the really horror begins at that point. The show started. Paul Newman was transformed by alcohol. From the beloved American to a violent creature that frightened his new family, similar to how his father had scared him. The abuse cycle was reoccurring. Paul couldn't stop it because he was too weak. When after drinking, Paul lost his identity, Joanne characterized these incidents as sliving hell. When Paul would shout, his voice was gone. Walls had holes punched in them. Fling furnishings across rooms. Ashley's kids fled in fear. The individual as a movie star. America at originally a furious alcoholic who made his family's life as a misery. Paul would awaken. Woke up the following morning with no recollection of his aggression. However, his spouse and children recalling every awful moment. The nightmare continued for years. Paul would pledge to abstain from alcohol and maintain sobriety for a few weeks before resuming the dangerous trend. His kids strained to see the warning indicators and would go into hiding when Daddy began. Joanne was always afraid, without knowing when her beautiful spouse will all become a shouting madman who could cause harm to others. At last, Jonah reached her limit. Early on in the 1960s, she made the last-ditch choice in order to protect herself and the kids by fleeing to Switzerland. She packed up everything and abruptly departed, declining to take Paul's calls. 6 months later, she continued, total quiet as Paul collapsed on an emotional level. Paul was completely demolished by the abandonment of Joanne. He took a plane to Switzerland and stood for nights. Resembled a psychotic stalker outside her hotel, knocking on the door, pleading with her to speak with him. When she refused to respond, he would sob as he collapsed on the stairs. Like a baby, very embarrassing himself in public. The legendary Paul Newman was reduced to a pitiful drunken plea. For slivers of the woman's attention, his violence had drove them away. Paul was compelled to confront the split reality in a manner he had never experienced before. He knew that drinking was ruining everything that was important to him, and if he would lose Joanne if he didn't get clean forever. The cessation procedure but Paul's fixation on Joni given him the fortitude to persevere. Detox and make a commitment to abstinence. When Joanne eventually consented to return, Paul had very stringent guidelines to go with him or she would abandon him forever. However, upon their reunion, things got more convoluted. With his head clear, Paul's sexual urge after drinking became utterly ravenous. They were having up to 6 sexual encounters per day. However, that was insufficient for Paul's illness, wishes he had to manage each and every facet of their private lives, turning their bedroom into his own warped fantasy playground that pushed all the limits. Later, Joan disclosed information that astounded everyone who heard them. Paul had an obsession with play-out situations in which he had all authority over her. He would pose as a judge, police officer, or military leader as she performed different victims. Paul would bind her, whispering, "I'm sick." With silk-carved hands, he fabricated a conversation and coerced her into situations that went on for several hours. This wasn't typical intimacy between a married couple. One person's need to dominate. Was this and extraordinary levels of control? Toto make room for these bizarre games. Paul constructed Joanne referred to the cottage in their mansion in Beverly Hills. This was a specifically created space with a lot of red velvet drapes that provided complete privacy, soundproof walls, a bed, and light trapped in sheets of black silk. It appeared like a scene from a scary movie. However, for Joanne and Paul, it was where their union was a reality. They would spend hours disappearing into this chamber as their kids figured out how to stay away and act as though they were not listening anything. Joanne acknowledged that these perverted their marriage was preserved by their sessions. Collectively, when they quarreled over processing alcohol, his envy, or his awful, they would enter the cabin to parent. And turn their rage into illness. Sexual games. Without this, she said, outlet, their union would have come to an end years in the past. However, what sort of that degree of twisting is necessary in a relationship? Actions merely to stay alive. It sounds more akin to addiction than love. The kids understood that something strange was taking place, but were too young to comprehend. When jazz-loud music began to emanate from the Hava, they discovered how to create themselves. Limited. A toddler once unintentionally, Paul screamed when someone knocked on the door, dubbed them to leave, then raised the youth music to block off any unpleasant feelings that were taking place within. Those children grew up believing that this was typical conduct for married pairs. However, even the most strong sexual fixation was unable to save Paul's worst failure as a dad. His bond with his eldest Scott, his first marriage's son, was a total catastrophe from the start. Scott, growing up in the shadow of his well-known father, always being likened to a film star that he would never be able to match. Though with the crushing pressure, Scott started acting out by using drugs and alcohol. Taking the same destructive route as his Paul attempted to assist after his father had walked, but was clueless about how to be actual father. He was either not present on to severe while he was on film shoots or establishing a bond based on conflict as opposed to affection. Scott greatly wanted his father's acceptance but only received criticism, and the separation between they increased until Scott began to tell individuals who weren't truly Paul's father at all. The catastrophe Paul ought to have anticipated the arrival of when Scott passed away from drugs in 1978, overdose at the age of 28. Paul was totally demolished, crumbling over the lifeless body of his son, and self-blame for the demise. He was aware that if he'd been a more effective father, more a comprehension as well as Scott may still be living. However, rather than taking note of Heiser, Paul just increased the sense of shame to his already perverted mentality. At this point, rumors began to circulate. Rumors of Paul's secret homosexual affairs that almost destroyed his union with Joanne. Several sources asserted that Paul was experiencing enduring sexual partnership with Amelie film star of comparable renown. The allegedly began on a movie set. It went on for several months before Joan discovered by anonymous correspondence that detailed Paul's precise location and time of arrival, meeting his partner, a man. As soon as Joan presented the evidence to Paul, hadn't attempted to refute it at all. The battle that ensued was so brutal that police were summoned by neighbors who thought someone was being killed. They heard screaming, furniture smashing, Joan Paul's frantic cries and sorrowful tears to give an explanation. The disclosure that her spouse was also everything was ruined by sleeping with men. Joanne believed she was aware of their union. Following that, Joanna lives in a state of perpetual worry, wondering what other nefarious secrets did Paul conceal. She asked him about his late-night movie watching sets and started to doubt his near relationships with co-stars who were men. Paul was, however, caught between his constructed public persona as the ideal gentleman in America and his personal preferences that he was unable to comprehend or manage the strain of leading to separate lives. His drinking and aggressive actions were still Despite all of his accomplishments, Paul Newman lived his whole life in the spotlight, feeling like a total phony. Even when he rose to prominence as one of Hollywood's top, he never thought he was worthy of any stars. Of it. At glitzy gatherings surrounded by admirers and accolades, Paul would sip and murmur that he wasn't suitable for focus. He was always making comparisons himself to actual performers such as Marlon Brando. Considering himself merely a pretty face of the fortunate person, Paul's hate of himself was so profound that he declined significant roles in films since he didn't believe he had the talent to deal with them. On movie sets, despite the fact that directors commended Paul would return to his work, trailers certain that everyone was slying to cheer himself up, he would destroy the mirrors in his changing area since he detested staring at himself, observing nothing but void behind the attractive face that brought him notoriety. His nervousness stemmed directly from his psychological abuse from the father, which had persuaded little Paul that he was useless and undeserving of affection. Evanoff, the most renowned performers in Paul's history, included his father's harsh voice in his mind, always anticipating revealed to be fraudulent. He stated in his private diaries in which he felt a Strosthoft scarecrow, Javerian, but ultimately going to believe. That was the twisted irony. In fact, Paul's suffering and insecurity made him a better actor. His performances had genuine feelings since they originated from real pain, connected audience with his fictional characters since they felt actual battle below. However, Paul was unable to recognize this connection. He only sensed the disdain of his father and the conviction that he was deceiving the world about his true nature. Paul resembled his connection to Johnny grew considerably more acute and complex when he wasn't fighting his own demons. Paul's secret affairs or alcohol use could be extremely affectionate and loving. He would continually caress Joanne, holding her hand while eating, encircling his arms when she was cooking, and discovering numerous methods to demonstrate physicality all day long. Their kids recalled these instances of affection as evidence that their parents truly have a deep affection for one another. In spite of everything, the altercations and strangeness, they observed worst arguments and times of icy quiet. However, they also noticed that since a relationship and dedication that despite being mistreated for decades, addiction as well as treachery, it wasn't a wholesome partnership by any standard. Yet it was authentic in ways that the majority of Hollywood marriages ended in divorce. Paul Newman passed away from cancer in 2008. Joanne is left alone after 50 years of complexities in memory. The sorrow was intimidating, but it worsened when Joanne started to get Alzheimer's, which began to erase her thoughts precisely when she most needed her memory. As her health deteriorated, Jonah forgot a lot of things. However, astonishingly, Paul's memories remained distinct and vivid, even in her state of mental confusion. Joanne would inquire about Paul, where he went and when he would return. Her relatives became aware of their love had been so consuming and strong, even fatal brain disorders couldn't ruin it entirely. The picture of the man in charge of her life was burned for more than 50 years, so firmly believing that nothing could take it out. Joanne's family today Chris on Paul's charitable work began. Uses wealth and notoriety to support causes that are important to them. The donations from the Newman's own foundation, millions of dollars, demonstrating that even individuals as deranged and difficult since Paul Newman may perform someone difficult in the world. Perhaps that's his true not the ideal union everyone was convinced, but the evidence who are injured can produce something significant if they put in enough effort. The Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward story eliminates all romantic ideas regarding Hollywood romances. There the foundation of the relationship was treachery, maintained by perverted sexual games, and almost ruined by addiction and violence on several occasions. However, in some way I tendered for 50 years and produced anything that Alzheimer's disease cannot fully. Neither was Paul Newman a hero or ideal gentleman.